George Matthews never imagined the woman who helped him bury his wife would one day become the same person who would bury him. Emily Carter, the woman he trusted to heal his heart after tragedy, had a much darker plan in mind, one that would unfold over 2 decades and end with a chilling twist that no one saw coming. In the small, quiet town of Maplewood, George Simmons was well known and respected. He had built a solid reputation over the years as a reliable, hard-working man who provided for his family. He had the perfect life: a beautiful wife, Rachel, and 2 children who adored him. To anyone who knew them, it seemed like the ideal family, the kind of suburban dream most people longed for. The Simmons family home, nestled on a leafy street, was a symbol of their happiness and success. Life was good, or so it appeared. But in the summer of 1995, everything changed. Rachel, George's beloved wife, died in a tragic car accident. At least that was the story the authorities told George, and what he believed for some time. The report indicated that Rachel had been driving home after a day of shopping when her car swerved off the road, flipping several times before crashing into a tree. It was the kind of accident that could happen to anyone, and so the investigation was quickly closed. For George, the loss was unimaginable. He couldn't fathom life without Rachel. She was his partner, his best friend, the mother of his children. The grief was overwhelming. But as time passed, George began to feel something unsettling gnaw at him. There were little things that didn't add up. The police had told him it was an accident, but there was something about Rachel's death that didn't sit right with him. He started asking questions that no one could answer, and the more he probed, the more he began to wonder if there was more to Rachel's death than anyone had let on. At first, George turned to the police, but the answers he received were vague. Investigators assured him that it was a tragic accident, nothing more. But then, whispers from some of Rachel's old friends started to surface. They mentioned strange things about her past, things George hadn't known before. They spoke of a former friend of Rachel's named Emily Carter. At first, George dismissed it, thinking it was just gossip. But the more he heard, the more curious he became. Emily was someone who had been in Rachel's life long before George came into the picture, a woman who had been close to Rachel during a time of turmoil in her life. There had been rumors of a falling out between the two, something that Rachel had never spoken about in detail. George couldn't ignore the mounting suspicion that Emily might have been involved in something darker than he had realized. As George's suspicions grew, he decided to look into Emily Carter's background. What he found startled him. Emily had a history of questionable behavior. Though she had never been arrested, there were stories of her being involved in strange situations, particularly around the time of Rachel's death. Some people believed Emily had a hand in Rachel's demise, but the evidence was circumstantial at best, and there was no proof to bring charges against her. As far as George knew, Emily was just a person from Rachel's past, someone who had faded into the background. But something about the way she had been mentioned in connection with Rachel's death stuck with him. And then, one evening, Emily Carter showed up at George's door. She came offering condolences, claiming she had heard about Rachel's passing and wanted to extend her sympathy. George was taken aback but polite. After all, Emily had been a part of Rachel's life for a time, so it seemed only natural for her to reach out. What George didn't know was that Emily's appearance was not a simple act of kindness. It was the beginning of something much darker, a slow manipulation that would draw him in, just as it had so many others before him. At that moment, George couldn't have known that the woman who killed his wife was about to enter his life in a way that would change everything, leading him down a path from which there would be no return. Months passed after Rachel's death. and George found himself in a deep, persistent fog of grief. His days felt hollow, and the house that had once been filled with laughter and the bustle of family life now echoed with silence. His children, now teenagers, were struggling to cope with their mother's absence, and George found himself unsure of how to help them. As much as he tried to focus on his work and keep a routine, nothing could fill the void left by Rachel. It was during this time that Emily Carter reappeared in George's life. One rainy afternoon, she knocked on his door. She had a bouquet of flowers in hand and an expression of sincere sympathy on her face. Emily explained that she had heard of Rachel's passing and wanted to offer her support. She spoke in the kind of gentle, soft tone that made her seem almost vulnerable. George, still reeling from the loss of his wife, didn't hesitate to let her in. The conversation began with small talk. She asked how he was doing, how the children were holding up, and whether he needed anything. Her concern seemed genuine, even though something about her presence felt odd. George found himself too emotionally exhausted to question it, and Emily's soothing voice and calm demeanor made him feel as though he was talking to someone who truly understood the depth of his pain. Over the next few weeks, Emily continued to visit George, often bringing more flowers or homemade meals, saying she wanted to help him in any way she could. She seemed to be the only person who understood what he was going through. His friends and family had their own lives to deal with, and though they meant well, they often didn't know how to connect with George in his grief. But Emily was always there, providing a listening ear and never pushing him to move on before he was ready. She also began to make herself indispensable in other ways. Emily offered to help with household tasks, taking care of things that George just couldn't bring himself to deal with. It was as if she had become a lifeline, a constant source of comfort during a time when everything else in his life seemed to be falling apart. She would check in on him after work, bringing news of people in town who were concerned about him, as if trying to keep him connected to the world outside his grief. Soon, their bond deepened. The lines between sympathy and friendship blurred as George found himself spending more and more time with Emily. She became a source of strength for him, and though he had never considered it before, he realized that he was starting to care for her in a way that went beyond mere gratitude. His loneliness and the emotional hole left by Rachel's death made him vulnerable, and Emily, with her kind words and constant presence, filled that void in a way no one else had. At first, George was hesitant. He had loved Rachel deeply, and the idea of moving on so soon felt wrong. But Emily was persistent in her support, and over time George began to feel a growing attraction toward her. She was easy to talk to, comfortable to be around, and seemed to understand him in a way that no one else did. He told himself that it was just companionship, a need to not feel so alone, and that he wasn't rushing into anything. Emily, for her part, was patient, never pressing him and allowing him to set the pace. But as weeks turned into months, George started to notice something peculiar. Emily's behavior began to change. She had an air of possessiveness that hadn't been there before. She would insist on making decisions for him, offering suggestions on how to raise his children or how to handle financial matters. The more he relied on her, the more she seemed to want to take control. George didn't initially see it, or maybe he simply didn't want to. Emily had been such a comfort to him in his darkest days, so her increasing involvement in his life seemed like a natural extension of their growing relationship. But in the quiet moments, when he would lie awake at night, something about Emily's presence made him uneasy. There were times when her suggestions didn't seem to come from a place of care, but from a place of control. George chalked it up to his own confusion. He was grieving after all. He needed someone, and Emily had been there for him in ways no one else had. Yet deep down, George couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's support came at a cost. She wasn't just a friend. She wasn't just the woman who had been there for him after Rachel's death. Emily had become an integral part of his life. And with that, George felt himself slipping further away from the life he once had, from the family he had built with Rachel. It was as if he were being pulled into a world that Emily controlled, and he wasn't as sure if he wanted to break free or if he was too far gone to even try. As the months continued to pass, Emily's hold on George tightened. And yet, despite the oddities he noticed in her behavior, he couldn't bring himself to fully acknowledge the creeping doubts that lingered in his mind. Years went by, and George and Emily's life together appeared to be flourishing. On the surface, they presented the picture of a perfect couple. Their home was a place of peace and order, and Emily had integrated herself seamlessly into the role of stepmother to George's children. She was everything George had come to depend on, loving, caring, and seemingly devoted to him and his family. The children, now young adults, had come to accept Emily as a fixture in their lives, even though some of them harbored quiet reservations about how quickly she had entered their lives after Rachel's death. These feelings, however, were never voiced aloud, and the family carried on, keeping up appearances. George, though, had started to notice small inconsistencies in Emily's behavior over the years. At first, they seemed like harmless quirks, things that could easily be written off as stress or a mere passing mood. Emily was occasionally distant, her eyes clouded with what seemed like hidden thoughts. She would go out for late-night walks, returning just before dawn, her face always blank, as if she had been somewhere that drained her of energy. George would ask her where she'd been, but Emily would simply smile and say she needed time to think, that it was nothing. He would dismiss it, telling himself it was nothing to be concerned about. After all, they were happy, weren't they? But slowly, the cracks in Emily's perfect facade began to show more frequently. There were subtle signs that suggested Emily might not be as devoted as she appeared. She began to withdraw from George at odd moments. Sometimes she would refuse to join him for dinner or would leave abruptly in the middle of a conversation, offering vague excuses. Her behavior became increasingly erratic, and the once soothing, calm presence she had been in his life began to feel more like a distant storm brewing on the horizon. George found himself questioning her motives, wondering if there was something darker lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. It wasn't just her moods that started to raise alarms. Emily's interactions with others had changed. She became more controlling, more insistent about things she previously hadn't cared about. She took charge of family finances, offering to help his children with their personal affairs, making decisions about everything from vacations to what kind of clothes they should wear. She seemed to want to micromanage every aspect of their lives, even down to the smallest details. It was as though she were trying to reshape everything around her to fit her own vision, and George felt increasingly powerless to stop it. But there was more. George, ever the diligent man, began to dig deeper into Emily's past. He had begun to sense that something was wrong, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was hiding something from him, something important. He came across a series of old photographs from Emily's life before they had met, some of which were taken in places he didn't recognize, with people whose faces were unfamiliar. One particular photograph caught his attention. Emily standing with a man George had never seen before, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling in a way that looked too comfortable to be mere acquaintances. The man looked vaguely familiar, but George couldn't place him. As he stared at the photo, a chill ran down his spine. Further investigation revealed a series of troubling connections. Emily had a history that was far more complicated than she had let on. She had been involved in numerous relationships, all of which had ended suddenly and often tragically. In fact, George found that several of her past partners had died under mysterious circumstances, many of them suddenly and without clear explanation. Some had even been reported missing, only for their bodies to turn up weeks or months later in remote locations. The pattern was undeniable. But Emily's involvement was never suspected. She had always been able to distance herself from these tragedies, either by playing the role of the innocent victim, or by simply fading into the background once the police started asking questions. George's stomach churned as he realized that in all likelihood, Emily had been the cause of these deaths, and that he had unwittingly married a woman with a dark, twisted past. As his suspicions mounted, so did the tension between them. Emily seemed to sense that something had changed in George. He grew quieter, more distant, no longer so willing to simply let her take charge. He started questioning her about her late-night outings and her secretive behavior. Emily would brush off his concerns with a laugh, telling him that he was overthinking things. Yet George couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in a house built on lies, and that one day everything would come crashing down around him. But still, he hesitated to confront her. There was a part of him that didn't want to believe the truth. The woman he had married, the woman who had been his rock, could she really have been capable of all those terrible things? George was torn between the life he had built with her and the mounting evidence that his wife was not the woman he thought she was. Every time he tried to uncover the truth, Emily was there, smooth-talking and calm, deflecting his questions with ease. The more he dug, the more he began to feel like he was playing a dangerous game, one in which Emily always seemed to be one step ahead of him. The pressure began to mount on George and the unease in his gut grew. But it was too late for him to back out now. As Emily continued her manipulations, George was drawn deeper into a web of deceit, one that he was beginning to fear he might never escape. By the summer of 2017, George's unease had reached a boiling point. What had started as a simple nagging suspicion had transformed into a full-blown sense of dread. Emily's behavior had become erratic, her control over his life suffocating. But even with all the unsettling signs, George could never fully bring himself to confront her. Every time he tried, Emily skillfully turned the tables, casting doubt on his perceptions and making him feel like the one with the problem. In her eyes, he was just overthinking, unable to let go of his late wife's memory. Despite everything, George's love for Emily still lingered, however warped it had become. She had been there for him when Rachel died, and for a long time, Emily had filled the void left in his heart. But now, George felt as if he were drowning. The man who had once been sure of everything was now questioning his every move. The facade that Emily had worked so hard to build was crumbling, and the truth was just beyond reach. A truth George was terrified to face. One evening, George came home early from a business trip hoping to surprise Emily. His flight had been delayed, but he decided to make the best of it. It was well past midnight, and the house was unusually quiet. As he approached the front door, he noticed something odd. A light in the kitchen was on, casting long shadows in the hallway. He pushed the door open, calling out to Emily, but there was no answer. As he walked through the house, everything seemed still, too still. The sense of unease he had been carrying around for so long deepened. He finally found Emily in the living room, sitting alone in the dark. She looked up, her face pale, eyes wide with something that resembled fear. She quickly tried to cover it with a smile, but it was too late. George's heart raced. Something was wrong. Something he couldn't explain, but he could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Emily claimed that she had been resting, just needing some time alone after a stressful week. But George wasn't convinced. Something in her demeanor, something in the air, was off. Before he could say anything, Emily snapped at him, accusing him of being paranoid. She was tired, she explained, and needed to sleep. She didn't want to deal with his constant questions anymore. Her words hit George harder than he expected. His thoughts raced as he tried to process what was happening. This wasn't just a simple argument. There was something deeper here. He couldn't place his finger on it, but the weight of the situation was too much to ignore any longer. The next day, George decided to do something he had avoided for years. He went through the house, rifling through old paperwork, files, and documents. He knew he was crossing a line, but the gnawing feeling inside him pushed him to do it. What he uncovered shocked him to his core. There, in a hidden drawer in Emily's study, he found a collection of old newspaper clippings and police reports. They told a horrifying story, one he had never imagined. Emily was connected to a series of deaths that stretched back more than a decade, each one more chilling than the last. They were always covered up, swept under the rug, but the pattern was undeniable. Emily had been involved in multiple incidents, each one eerily similar to Rachel's death. A strange accident here, a sudden illness there, all leading to men vanishing from her life. George's hands trembled as he scanned the reports, piecing together a chilling truth. He could no longer deny it. Emily had killed before. She had orchestrated Rachel's death, just as she had done with others. It was all coming together, and George realized that the woman he had married, the woman he had trusted, was a cold-blooded killer, but the revelation was too much to bear. His mind raced, torn between disbelief and horror. Emily had managed to manipulate him for years, weaving a web of lies so convincing that even now, as he stood holding the evidence in his hands, he wasn't sure what to do next. Confronting her seemed like a dangerous move. He had seen her temper, the way she could turn from sweet and caring to something else entirely in an instant. Would she kill him too, just like she had killed Rachel? Or had she already been planning his demise all along? As the night wore on, George grew more frantic. He couldn't sit idly by while this woman, this monster, controlled his life. But what was he supposed to do? He could call the police, but they would need more than just his suspicions to take action. He needed proof, something concrete that would tie her directly to Rachel's murder, to all the other deaths she had been involved in. And yet, as he thought of the life he had built, the children he had raised, the love he had once felt for Emily, the question lingered. Was it too late to escape? At that moment, Emily appeared at the door. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and George realized in a sickening flash that she had known what he had found. Her smile was gone. There was no more pretending. He had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. George stood frozen, the document still clutched in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily's eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. There was no sign of the woman who had once been his comforting presence, the woman who had soothed his pain. This was something darker, something far more dangerous. He could see it in her posture, the way she held herself as though she was prepared for this moment, as though she had been waiting for him to discover the truth all along. She didn't say anything at first. Her gaze was sharp, unblinking, as if she were assessing him, calculating her next move. For a brief moment, George thought about running, about escaping the house and never looking back. But the weight of the evidence in his hand anchored him to the spot. He couldn't run anymore. He had uncovered her secret, and now there was no turning back. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice calm, almost too calm. "You've found it, haven't you?" she said, her words laced with a chilling sense of finality. There was no hint of remorse, no shock at being caught, only the quiet acknowledgement that the game was over. "You've always been so oblivious, George, so wrapped up in your grief, in your need for someone to take care of you, that you never stopped to ask the right questions." George's stomach churned, the implications of her words sinking in. He had trusted her, loved her, and in return, she had orchestrated the death of his wife, manipulated him into believing that she was the one person who understood his pain. He had been nothing more than a pawn in her sickening game. "I never wanted to hurt you, George," Emily continued, her voice softening as if to lure him back into a false sense of security. You were just so vulnerable. I gave you what you needed, and in return I got what I wanted. It was always going to be like this. You couldn't have seen it. You were too weak." The words struck him like a blow to the chest. She was confessing, but there was no guilt in her voice, no trace of sorrow. Emily wasn't just a killer. She was a master manipulator, someone who had carefully constructed her life around a web of lies and deceit. She had used him, and worse, she had used his grief as a weapon to entrap him. His mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what he had just learned, but everything seemed to blur together, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "Why, Emily?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why Rachel? Why me?" Emily's eyes flickered with something cold, something almost amused. She stepped closer to him, her presence overwhelming. "You think I killed Rachel because of you?" "No, George, she was a liability. She was in the way. You never would have let me in if she were still around. She had to go. And as for you, well, you were perfect. A broken man, searching for someone to fill the hole in your heart. I was the answer to your pain. I knew that. You just didn't realize it until it was too late." The weight of her words pressed down on him, and George felt like he might collapse under the realization of how completely he had been deceived. He had never known her true nature. All this time he had thought he was healing, but in reality, he had been slowly unraveling. As Emily continued to close the distance between them, George's instincts kicked in. He knew he needed to act, and fast. The fear that had been growing inside him for years finally took root, turning to anger and desperation. But before he could make a move, Emily raised a hand, silencing him with a simple gesture. Her smile returned, but it was different now. Cold, calculating. "You've been a good husband, George," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "But you've outlived your usefulness. You see, you were never meant to be the final piece of my puzzle. You were just another step. And now, I have everything I need." In that moment, everything clicked into place. Emily had been biding her time, waiting for George to reach the point where he would have no choice but to trust her completely. She had manipulated him, controlled his life, all while carefully hiding her true intentions. And now that the truth was out, it was clear that she wouldn't stop until she had complete control, not just over him, but over everything. A sickening realization washed over George. He was just another victim in Emily's web, just like Rachel, just like all the other men before him. But he wasn't ready to give up without a fight. With trembling hands, he dropped the papers, taking a step back. "I won't let you get away with this," he said, his voice shaking but steady. For a split second, Emily's eyes flashed with something almost imperceptible. A flicker of doubt, or maybe fear. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating expression that had become all too familiar to George. She took another step toward him. "Oh, George," she whispered almost pityingly. "It's already too late." Before George could react, Emily moved quickly, her hand reaching for the drawer where she kept her things. In that instant, George understood that he had made a fatal mistake by confronting her. He had walked right into the trap, and just like that, the woman who had killed his wife was about to take his life as well.